Tanse, everybody. My name is Dakota Bear. I am co-organizer of the Resistance Campaign. Welcome to our webinar. We are hosting some special guests here. We will be talking about treaty territories, non-treaty territories. We will be speaking about the white paper of 2019. We will also be answering some questions within this webinar. So I would just like to welcome you all. Again, my name is Dakota Bear, and I am from Unceded, Unsurrendered Treaty 6 territories.
Hi, everybody. My name is Casey Desjardins. I am also the co-founder of Protect Our People and the co-organizer of the Resistance Campaign. Today, we have very special guests with us, Russ Diabo from Kahnawake, Sylvia McAdams from Treaty 6, Rachel Snow from Treaty 7, and Judy Wilson, the Niskoneth of the Shuswap Nation. So maybe I'll get you guys to introduce yourselves a little bit, talk a little bit about where you're from, and some of the work you do in your communities. Maybe we can start with Rachel.
Good afternoon. Hi, this is Rachel Snow. I'm a I'm a Iahe Nakota from Minithni or Morley, Alberta, and I do work with policy analyst work as well as I have my Juris Doctor, so I am a trained legal technician, and the work I do primarily is grassroots for our First Nation people in at the band levels, or with any work that I can do to help our people have an understanding of what mainstream society is doing or putting on us.
Awesome.
Awesome, thank you.
It's good to have you here. Maybe we'll go into Judy Wilson.
Means Chief, Judy Wilson from the Niskoneth, Taysakweapim, the Shuswap Nation in the interior of British Columbia. I'm here today to be able to share some information on what our people are going through in regard to the White Paper 2.0, and also shed some light on some of the historical work our ancestral chiefs did in 1910, and also our real strong leadership we had in 1969 that fought against the initial White Paper, and really secured our title and rights, but we're constantly being facing all the legislative changes that are happening across Canada, but also most importantly the extinguishment and the erosion of our title and rights in regards to the genocidal policy and legislation that continues. It's some of our chiefs describe it as a death by 1,000 cuts in regard to the genocidal legislation, and our leadership in our community have been really strong in regard to the outstanding land question. Many parts of British Columbia are not under the modern treaty. There's some of the historical treaties, Treaty 8 in Northeast British Columbia, and also the pre-Confederation treaties on the island. Mm-hmm. But mainly the majority of our communities, which are under the Union of East Indian Chiefs, are outside of the modern treaty process, and we've been working really hard to stand up our sovereignty and stand up our title and rights. BC only joined the Canadian Confederation in 1871, and it had the condition for BC to join Canada. They put through that railway as part of the conditions, and that's happening to us right now with how they're trying to do that unilateral Trans Mountain pipeline through our territory, about 513 kilometers through our territory. That was all unilateral of the federal government to purchase it, and so we have that issue happening to us. Our chiefs in 1910, they had a Sir Laurier memorial document where our chiefs outlined, how we would, how our relationship would be with the settler government, colonial government. They were, there's some confusion though. It was more like the numbered or international treaties. It wasn't the modern treaties, and that's where we get people using our 1910 Sir Laurier document in the context of the modern treaty, but was never ever thought of in the modern context treaty. It was always thought in as a sovereign-based inherent title and right position where we never gave up our title or our caretaker responsibilities. It was really about coexisting, and we had a process that was documented on how the forts had to lease land from us or pay for passage for their passage for themselves, but also putting their horses or cattle in, or even fishing. So there was a relationship there. It wasn't based on where any of our time rights went under the province or the colonial government or Canada. So that's why we still say that outstanding land question needs to be addressed by the federal government. But the Union BC chiefs, many of our chiefs, including my father, Grand Chief Joe Manuel, and many of and my uncle, Grand Chief George Manuel, they fought against the 1969 white paper policy, and basically the chiefs of the day came up with that name, termination plan, termination policy. It's actually a poster in the union office that hangs in there that outlines self-determination or termination. So it's really interesting to see that poster. I wish we could get it out and share it, but I was trying to get another photo of it so we can just share it around. But our chiefs of the day already outlined, so that was coined by them, that meaning what that termination is. So again, the chiefs today, and they mentioned it's white paper 2.0. That's really the reality that we're really facing. So our chiefs did not agree to Pierre Trudeau's 1973 Statement of Native Claims, creating these modern treaty policies. So yeah, I remember, I think it was, our chiefs, I think it was Chief Bob Manuel at the day, 1980s, they organized the Constitution Express, failed to, that whole, it was right across Canada to deal with the Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. And then, a lot of that still relied on the doctrine of discovery, which is still today, because that's what Canada says is Canada's assertion of sovereignty and territorial rights. So we're continually fighting against that, as our chiefs did, and that's why we need to, our community and the international work done under Chief Arthur Manuel, he brought it along with his dad to the international level. So we continually do that work. They did lots and lots of work, and then we need that monitoring to show what Canada's doing and a lot of the interventions. But I'll stop there. I've got a lot more to build on, but I just wanted to give sort of a context what we're dealing with here in British Columbia.
Wow, that's powerful, comprehensive. Maybe we'll ask Russ to introduce yourself and some of the work that you do around your community. Russ, I think your mic might be off if we can't really. There we go.
Sorry. I'm a member of the Mohawk Nation of Kahnawake, and for several decades I've been involved in doing policy analysis for different communities, organizations, and lately I've been involved with Indigenous activist networks of Defenders of the Land and the Truth Campaign. And basically, I've been trying to bring awareness to our people, and I ran for national chief in the 2018 election to try and bring awareness to the chiefs about the threat that the Trudeau agenda has on the assault on our rights, the policies that they're bringing forward. So that's what I've been mainly working on, is trying to bring awareness to, what we've been seeing happening over the last 50 years when the white paper, the 1969 white paper on Indian policy was first introduced. They never stopped implementing it.
Great. There's all this talk about the white paper and the termination policies. Can we kind of give a little bit of context on to what a white paper really is and what the white paper of 1969 is, Russ?
Yeah. Well, basically, a white paper is a federal document, like a discussion paper. Usually, if there's a topic that the federal government wants to start people talking about before it becomes policy, they issue a white paper. For example, a white paper on defense policy. Well, in 1969, they proposed a white paper on Indian policy. And in there, the proposals were very specific. It was about eliminating the legal distinctions between status Indians and the rest of Canadians. That was the first thing they wanted to do, was eliminate that. They wanted to do that by dissolving the Department of Indian Affairs within 5 years, to abolish the Indian Act and remove the reference in Canada's first constitution, the British North America Act, that said the federal government's responsible for Indians and lands reserved for Indians. So they wanted to amend the constitution to erase any reference to Indians or Indian lands. And they wanted to convert reserve lands into private property so that it could be sold by the band or by its members. And they wanted to transfer responsibility for Indian affairs to the provinces, the same as other Canadians get their services. Mm-hmm. And that means getting, getting rid of the Department of Indian Affairs. And they wanted to provide funding to deal with the poverty on a transition basis for economic development. And they want to appoint a commissioner to address outstanding land claims and end the treaties. So they basically wanted to cut and run. So it was a termination plan that they proposed in 1969 in what was called a white paper on Indian policy. And what do we see today with that was Pierre Elliott Trudeau that proposed that, with his Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, who then wound up becoming Minister of Justice during the constitutional talks in the 1980s, and becoming Prime Minister in the 1990s and into the 2000s. And now in 2019, after almost 4 years of Justin Trudeau's government, we see that last February he proposed recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework, which he said was a collection of policies and laws. So now we can see that the big picture that they're doing is a national plan, basically to carry out the objectives of the 1969 white paper. And that's what we've been calling White Paper 2.0 or White Paper 2019, is this big national plan, which they're trying to pass under the disguise as reconciliation and nation-to-nation relationships.
Right. So the White Paper 2.0, it still continues to follow the same agenda as the White Paper of 1969, the termination of Indigenous rights and titles. We know that the Rights and Recognition Framework was tabled in December 2018. How does that agenda and how does the spirit of the White Paper still continue on after the framework has been tabled?
Well, they have a land claims policy that goes back to 1973 under Pierre Trudeau about extinguishing title and rights. They came up with land claims called comprehensive claims, for what they call the modern treaties now, and specific claims, where they basically want to end off any outstanding obligations. Right. Remember, I said in 1969 they wanted to do an Indian Claims Commissioner and they wanted to get rid of end of the treaties. Well, they're doing that partially through their land claims policies. And then in 1995, they came up with what they call the inherent right policy, where they unilaterally defined the inherent right to self-government to basically mean you're going to convert Indian Act bands into municipal governments. So that's part of Justin Trudeau's national reconciliation plan, is to implement what he calls a fourth level of government in Canada. Indigenous governments are a fourth level, he said, in 2016. And so those land claims policies are still being implemented from his father's day. The self-government policy, which actually Jean Chrétien came up with when he was prime minister, to municipalize communities, is still what they're implementing. And they've introduced legislation to basically assimilate bands into the Canadian property and taxation systems. And that's the First Nations Land Management Act, the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. All this legislation and these national institutions they've created are all about, assimilating bands and reserves into the Canadian mainstream system. So this is all part of what the framework that Justin Trudeau announced last year is about. He tabled passing it in one law, and instead he's doing it in pieces through the legislation that's going through the House of Commons, like the language law, the child welfare law, to get more control over those areas. And also, he's passing a law. He hid a law in an omnibus budget bill, C-96, to create these two new departments, the Department of Indigenous Services and Crown Indigenous Relations, basically to implement the termination plan. He needs the Department of Indigenous Services to kind of be the status quo department until they can get bands to sign on to these modern agreements and move over onto the Crown Indigenous Relations Department under a new fiscal relationship, new funding arrangements, and under these new modern termination agreements. So that's why he's trying to pass that law to create these two new departments and dissolve the Department of Indian Affairs.
Okay.
Anyways, all of these pieces fit together into a larger picture of governance and fiscal policies that they want to impose.
Yeah, I think it's really important to talk about how instead of pushing it all under one framework, that it is now continuing on, but in little pieces of legislation and policies.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And I just had a quick question for Chief Judy Wilson here, because when me and my partner Casey here, we are discussing and trying to break down the things that are happening, some of the language that we're using is sovereignty, treaty rights, and inherent rights. And I think that it would be useful for the people to know what is the difference between a treaty right and what is inherent right. And I think that would be a good person to ask for that.
Thank you for that question. Well, inherent title and rights, you ought to know that the courts defined common law views of Aboriginal title. But when we talk about our inherent right, it's we're born with it. We've the Creator gave us the Mother Earth to take care of, the caretaking responsibilities. We can't just sell them, trade them, or hand them away. Inherent means that we have that inherent right and responsibility. Under common law, they defined it through their processes. But with our inherent right comes our Indigenous laws and our legal orders, our traditions, customs, all of those things. So we're born with it. It's inherent. We haven't gone under any treaty process with Canada. Our stories of origin and creation, and also our stories tell us what our roles and responsibilities and teachings are in our nation, and how we're structured, and governance laws are all under that. It's supposed to have been what the 1910 chiefs outlined was a relationship, but not giving up our sovereignty. So it's a sovereignty-based inherent title and rights.
Right. I think it's also important to talk about that we do have this inherent right to the land, to the resources on that land, but we also have the obligation and the responsibility to take care of that land, to ensure that it will survive for the 7 generations to come, so our children can flourish and our children can succeed on this land. So talking about how the white paper, the agenda, how it could transfer reserves and bans into municipalities, maybe if I can pose this question to Rachel, how would this white paper agenda, how would these policies and legislations affect, you're from Treaty 7, how would it affect directly your territories and your band, and what are your concerns regarding that?
Well, I don't want to say that, I don't want to speak for the whole of Treaty 7, for one thing, or even for my band. But I would like to say that I think as what you're talking about here, the question that Chief Judy just answered, when we're talking about inherent rights or treaty rights, we're using those 2 different words because of mainstream, because of colonialism. Those are not even our words that we're having to define or think of in terms like that. All the people we were placed here, the Indigenous people, were placed on this land. We have obligations, responsibilities to the land, to our ancestors. And one of the things is to steward the land. That is why we agreed to share the land with the settlers. So we're agreeing to have a relationship with this newcomer society. The thing that is troubling us, or that is happening right now, is that the newcomer society is not living up to their responsibilities. So when we see things like the white paper in 1969, and I've mentioned this, my late father helped write that red paper, and he read out the red paper to the House of Commons, in the House of Commons in 1969, to Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was Justin Trudeau's father. So my family has had a history and a legacy of dealing with these machinations, or what the federal government is doing in trying to undermine or get away from actually upholding their fiduciary duties or the trust relationship. They are using, as Russ said, special words. They are kind of going around our Indigenous people in different ways, whether it's termination tables, First Nation land management, designating the land, telling our people that we have to designate the land, because telling the people that we have to designate the land for economic development, all these kinds of things that are happening, it's withering away at our original purpose. If we start to see ourselves as regular Canadian people who are using our land for economic development, we start to forget that original inherent duty. We start to lose our sovereignty, because now we're operating as business, or we're operating as people who are the we're operating as mainstream people. We're no longer operating as Indigenous people. We're forgetting that. So I think the overall danger to our tribes and to our people is that loss of reverence, and that loss of connection, that spiritual loss in understanding the land. I think that's the very hard thing that is going to happen, because when we talk about it being Indigenous, we talk about our languages, our ceremonies, our customs, and our traditions. All of that flows and comes with the land. So once we start to look at these fourth levels of government, once we start to look at municipalization, once we start to look at the land as a commodity, are we Indigenous anymore? And so I think those things that we were told to preserve for the next generations, we have to live them. And that's part of the fight right now, is because we do have our people going into mainstream. We do have our people getting educated. I have a law degree, but that doesn't mean that I accept that system over my Indigenous legal traditions. My Indigenous legal traditions, I feel, are the actual true laws of this land. And I feel that having learned or taken the mainstream education, all it's taught me is to be better equipped or able to fight for my people, and to articulate our point of view, to say what we need to do or what we are trying to do to the non-natives, or to mainstream, or to government, so that we can retain these things for our children. So when you talk about the dangers of municipalization, the danger is exactly what Perry Bellegarde said last week. The danger is that we will integrate and become Aboriginal Canadians, or shadows of the people who we once were. And I don't think that's what our ancestors intended for us. Right.
I think we have a big fight if that's the agenda, is to assimilate us into Canadian society. And I just want to welcome Sylvia. You are in the chat now. We see you. I just want, maybe if you can give a little brief introduction of who you are and where you come from.
Hello. My name is Sylvia McAdams. I am from the Treaty 6 lands, and I am Nihil. I am from the Nihil people. So what I'm going to talk about on my portion of this webinar is what the treaty terms and promises mean in terms of Treaty 6 That's where I'm located, is Treaty 6. I'm about 2.5 hours north of what is now referred to as Saskatoon. I am fluent in my people's language, and today I just wanted to talk about one of the treaty terms and promises. And we talk about unceded, unsurrendered land, and I want to make clear that all of our side of Turtle Island is unceded and unsurrendered. So for Treaty 6, and I write about this in my book called Nationhood Interrupted, Revitalizing Nihil Legal Systems, one of the treaty terms and promises, and these are really important to keep alive, and I know that Russ is going to talk about the white paper, and this is what the white paper is set out to extinguish. At the time of treaty making, and I'm a direct descendant of people who made treaty at the time of 1876 and 1878. The 1878 adhesion was done in Sounding Lake, and from what the elders have told me, there was 5,000 lodges that came to that adhesion. And one of them was my great-grandfather, Saisiwiham. One of the treaty terms and promise, and everything about these treaties is about land. It's all about land, which is one of the reasons why we were recently taken to court. My brother and I, we were taken to court about the question on land and about who has jurisdiction. So at the time of treaty making, I'm going to jump back and forth from the time of treaty making to what is happening today. At the time of treaty making, one of the treaty terms and promises is that a family of 5, more or less, will receive 1 square mile for the purposes of agriculture. So at the time when the reserves, every reserve across these numbered treaties was surveyed according to those, what people refer to today as allotments. So at the time of treaty making, my family, who took up 1 square mile of agriculture, would have been surveyed the 1 square mile, and then they would have began their livelihood of agriculture. So fast forward to today, this federal government, the Trudeau government, and subsequent colonial governments refuse to honor that particular treaty term and promise, and I've been pushing for that, and that's only one of the treaty terms and promises. Can you imagine what families could do with their 1 square mile? The economic opportunities that have been withheld from our people. And when I say economic opportunities, I am confined to the colonizers' language. When I say economic opportunities, it is understood by Nihil, their laws and their trade that we had in terms of working with other nations. So this is what my family and I, one of the things that we were trying to do in a location called Stony Lake. In my language, it's called Boasi Musagaihan, and that is where we used to meet with the Stony people. So it was there that we were trying to build shelter, and we're trying to build shelter to replace the shelter, a shelter that the provincial government had burnt down, allegedly burnt down. And again, I'm using the colonizers' language. They were going around burning down shelters. They were trying to push us off our land. So we were trying to rebuild that shelter that had been burnt down. And then we were charged for that. This is where Russ and the termination 2.0 comes into play. When we were trying to rebuild, the provincial government said, no, you can't do that unless you get a permit from us. And we said, no, we don't need to get a permit from you because we have jurisdiction over these lands and we have inherent right to build anywhere we want on Treaty 6. And then the provincial government said no. So there was this back and forth, no, yes, no, yes. So we ended up in court. They charged us for trying to build a permanent structure on their land. See, that's the doctrine of discovery. There's several layers of legal fiction at play here, and the provincial government is saying that they have jurisdiction. So when we went to court, we won. The case was dismissed, and one of the questions was, did the province have jurisdiction? And they couldn't show that they had jurisdiction. So this is where we're at today, and this is what we are at risk of losing. Even just a very simple thing as to build shelter on anywhere on our treaty lands, anywhere on Treaty 6, that is what we are at risk of losing. That's one of the things. But there's so many things that we are at risk today of losing. And I want to speak to the language speakers that may be listening in right now, and this is for you to hear, and I'll quickly translate after I'm done. Kaya sige skiwiha kiste kiwutong kapini pono kanipo ya kita kawi iwi so tiguya ko muniao tonan kui tema ka pono kisvega kui wasko ituti noma wapa kumuta Saskatoon siga tiwi go utino igutumu mo pai tsigai sino Swiss company we mamo payo ekui nagina kumia kuma mahte kui wasko itupitan kisniga kui wasko itutina no iksana kui temaihino ka kui aiwa ka temaihono munia mahte kui wasko itutitan. Tomorrow, all across our lands, including Saskatoon, there's a resistance happening. And I call upon all of you treaty people to come and stand against this white paper 2.0. Because if we don't, we are at risk of fulfilling the prophecies that have foretold of this time that will come, that there will be very few people who will see this through. There will be very few people. So we are at a very critical point. And Arthur Manuel used to warn us of this time, and now we've come to this point. It's up to us, the grassroots people, and all the leadership, whatever form they may look like, Indian Act, hereditary chiefs, because my dad is a hereditary Okima, and he will be in Saskatoon tomorrow to stand with the people. So I ask all of you, Mahte, listen to our plea. We are, for me, now I'm at the point where I'm almost begging for people to come and stand, and this is up to us now. This is up to us. And I commend Chief Judy, Russ Dybel, and Rachel, and all the others. Like, there's people in the background that are working really hard for this to happen, for this resistance, and the young people that are involved, Dakota and that the young lady. So I want to thank them as well. I'm staking and ask them no. So thank you. I have to log off because I have family issues, and so any questions I'm sure the other people will be able to answer. But I want to tell people, get to know Treaty 6. There is things that were left behind for us there, and we have to get to know that treaty really well in order to stand against what is happening today. How can I ask them? No.
Hi. Thank you, Sylvia. Thank you for your perspective, your knowledge, your insight. We really do appreciate it. I just wanted to add that Sylvia was a co-founder to I Don't Know More. She is situated in Treaty 6 territories, which I am from, Treaty 6 territories. And I just wanted to kind of build off of what she was saying about the promises within the treaty. And I think it's important to note, because a lot of the younger people, they don't really understand how important the treaty is to the ones that are living on the land and the promises that were made. For myself growing up, I didn't get a whole lot of that information coming. I didn't get a lot of education around treaties, but the main point that I feel the mainstream Canadian society wanted us to know is that we had equal opportunities to grow economically, just like the farmers did. We gave the First Nations people their parcels of land, but I would like to say that that's not true. That from where I'm registered, Witchkin Lake First Nations, we had a parcel of land set aside for our people, but 80% of that land was actually stolen from the Queen in 1913 to 1919. 80% was sold, and we never had or received any kind of compensation. They never consulted us when that had happened. So my band is going to court, and some of the things that were promised within that treaty too were the cows and the plows, the sickles and twines. We also never got a lot of that, what was promised. So from the outside looking in, a lot of people may think that, okay, you guys had a shot and it's your fault that you are where you're at, socioeconomic disadvantages that you face, but it's completely untrue. A lot of those promises were never kept. But we are here, the young people are here to learn and educate ourselves to make sure that we understand what's inside of the context of the treaties from where we are situated, the history here, but we're also where we are from. So one of those claims that I'm talking about is a specific claim, reserve alienation claim. Russ, do you mind answering how would this white paper 2.0, white paper 2019 affect claims that are happening right now, First Nations that are trying to battle over these lands that were stolen from them, or over these tools that were never given to them?
Well, I mentioned in 1973, Pierre Elliott Trudeau announced a Native Claims statement he made, where he announced the creation of 2 land claims policies. And that was in response to a Supreme Court of Canada decision called the Calder case in 1973 as well, which was split on whether Aboriginal title exists or not. That freaked out the government because they were investing in huge mega projects like, the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline in the Northwest Territories and the James Bay project in Quebec. So they announced this Native Claims policy to say they were going to negotiate 2 kinds of land claims. One was comprehensive claims in areas of Canada where there was no historic treaties dealing with lands. And so really that affected British Columbia, Quebec, the Atlantic region, the 5 provinces in the Atlantic, north of 60 in the Northwest Territories and the Yukon. And they also said they were going to negotiate specific claims. And specific claims, they said, to have to do with lawful obligations. In other words, when there was illegal management of reserve lands where they may have illegally, excuse me, or improperly sold reserves, or where they had, for example, trust funds. They may have sold timber off of a reserve and taken the money from the sale and put it into a trust fund in Ottawa. And if they mismanaged that money, didn't keep up with the interest rates, and that's a specific claim. But in the example you gave, that has to do with treaty land entitlement. That's where reserves are promised in the number treaties, particularly in Saskatchewan and Manitoba. The Natural Resources Transfer Agreement from the 1930s has a clause in there saying the provinces have to give up land for reserves that were promised under treaty. So the specific claims policy, it doesn't give land, it gives money. And so groups who settle a specific claim, which might be for hundreds of millions of dollars, has to turn around and buy their treaty land back, and then go through the red tape of getting it turned into a reserve and getting rid of the third-party interests that owned that, what was probably private property. Like if it was farmers that owned it and that, you had to go through these different rules. So the way White Paper 2.0 or White Paper 2019 affects that is Justin Trudeau's government has been dealing with specific claims through a joint technical working group with the Assembly of First Nations. The Assembly of First Nations was trying to follow up on 2007 agreement that occurred between Stephen Harper and the Assembly of First Nations. Bill Fontaine was national chief at the time. They called it Justice at Last. And it was supposed to help accelerate the settlement of the hundreds of specific claims that are backlogged. But the government, they were supposed to set up an independent claims tribunal. They dragged their feet on that. They dragged their feet on naming judges to that tribunal to process these claims. And the claims had to be 150 million or less. Otherwise, you couldn't put your specific claim into that independent claims process. So the Assembly of First Nations has been talking with the Justin Trudeau's government about coming up with an independent claims process to deal with those. But they've been dragging their feet on that, the Trudeau government. So they haven't gotten anywhere on that. So what the Trudeau government's been doing is kind of handpicking which specific claims they want to settle and which ones are going through that independent claims, that specific claims tribunal that exists right now. And over 50% of the specific claims that are backlogged in Canada are in BC, I believe. And Chief Judy Wilson probably could speak to that better than me on the obstacles they've had in trying to deal with this process through AFN and also on the ground with their own specific claims.
Yeah, I think Jody Wilson does have a lot of, it's different when you're regarding to treaty lands and the historic treaties that were signed and the modern day treaties of today. Can you maybe speak to about what modern day treaty means in your territory?
Well, in BC, we rejected the recognition and implementation of rights framework. But as it's mentioned here today, that's being piecemealed through the different approaches that the CERNA, Minister Bennett, and ADM Joe Wild are doing. And the effects are that we're outside of those modern treaty processes. So AFN and the groups that are willing to settle under comprehensive claims and the inherent right to self-government, are supporting the work moving forward in regard to what Minister Bennett is doing. The effects to us, though, is it's not recognition; it's actually extinguishment, because when the treaty rolls out in our nation, half our communities are in a treaty process. It's still extinguishment of our lands because it's taking settlement lands out of our territorial lands without the consultation, without the consent of our proper title holders, who are our people. So the modern treaties process, even though Minister Bennett has been saying that it's not extinguishment anymore, it certainly still is. And she's saying, that there's no more debt to that. There's still extinguishment in debt to us because it's removing our territorial lands from our people, who are the collective proper title holders. So our community in Squamish said that we would not negotiate under the modern treaty process or under the inherent right to self-government process, and or even the provincial processes that are being laid out that say provincial laws apply or the federal laws apply. As I'm speaking to you today, our people are meeting in Turtle Valley at a sacred fire the elders and the women set up to protect our land against biosolid dumping. And that's under the province that permitted that application. That's an example of what would happen to our territorial lands if we went under these policies. The provinces would have the jurisdiction and the veto to decide whatever they want. Our elders and our women will be joining National Day Action on Monday, standing up for our inherent title rights and protecting our sacred water. And that Turtle Valley is named Turtle Valley because of the painted turtle, which is an endangered risk species. So, not only are our elders and women standing up for the land, it's, our animals, the turtles, are standing up for the land too, which are very sacred to us. So I've been at many of the meetings where they've been talking about it at the AFN level and the provincial levels in regard to what's going on. And I supported and participated in the May 1st and 2nd rally in Edmonton. And, we need to stand together and we need to be able to work together. So the call to action, the National Day of Action, May 27th, is really critical. And I'll be joining Dakota there in Vancouver at noon on May 27th. So I'm also calling on all of our young people who did very articulate interventions at the United Nations of Indigenous Peoples Forum in New York about a month ago. I really support and believe in our youth. And it's just as our ancestors and our leaders in 1969 struggled with the white paper, I'm calling upon our young people today to stand up. The only difference I'm seeing today, though, is we don't have a lot of our leadership, our chiefs, our hereditary standing with us. So I'm really calling upon any of the leadership and hereditary that can stand with the youth today to challenge this white paper 2.0. It's really critical we do that because it is the fight of our life. This is a juncture, a critical turning point. We have to be able to say no to white paper 2.0.
Perfect, for sure. And I think me and Dakota really picked up on that urgency, which is why the Resistance Campaign was manifested, was because we were listening to the key policy analysts and the lawyers talking about this white paper and talking about the termination policies and the legislations that directly affect us and affect our sovereignty and our title and our rights. So just a reminder to the audience that may have just hopped on and are listening and watching. We are talking to Russ and Sylvia and Rachel, and we're talking to Judy about what the white paper is, talking about what the framework is, what this means to Indigenous people, and what this means to treaty people and non-treaty Indigenous people. So reminder that you can ask questions via Twitter, I don't know more, or I don't know more Facebook page. Make sure to use the hashtags whitepaper2019 so we can filter through the comments and find the questions. We do have a question from Doug, and he says, is there a white paper that people can go and read? If so, where? So is there a place where we can just go and read what a white paper is? Is that available to us?
Yeah, I'm sure you can find a website where you can find what a white paper is, but there are specific sites about white paper 1969 too, what that is. But the best source I found on that is a book called Making Canadian Indian Policy by Sally Weaver. She got access to all the bureaucrats in 1970, 71, and that to talk about how was the 1969 white paper developed. Those bureaucrats wouldn't have talked to Indigenous person the way they spoke to her. So that's a good source. If you want to know about the 1969 white paper, read that book. But there, like we were just saying, Trudeau announced a recognition and implementation of Indigenous rights framework last Valentine's Day in 2018. And in there, he said it's policies and laws. And also it's restructuring the government because they're dissolving the Department of Indian Affairs. So it's really not in one location. You have to read all the different pieces of what they're doing under policy, all the promises they made in 2015, and you have to piece that together to see what the big picture is. That's what I've had to do, is look at what they're doing on fiscal policy. What are they doing on changes to programs and services? What kind of changes are they making to the self-government and land claims policies, if any? And also this legislation they wanted to bring in, this rights recognition bill that they wanted to bring in before Christmas last year, that they decided to delay. But that didn't mean they stopped. They still have been talking to the Assembly of First Nations, who has an agreement with the federal government on shared priorities. They also have an agreement with the federal government on developing a new fiscal arrangement, new funding agreements policy. And the government is still going ahead. Although they said they're not going to replace the self-government and comprehensive land claims policies, which is what people call modern treaties, they said they're going to issue a directive by June to federal negotiators. And that's just as concerning because that means they're kind of continuing with the extinguishment and the municipal policies of denial and extinguishment, and they're not basing it on recognition and affirmation.
Mhm.
And they're manipulating their interpretation of the UN Declaration of Standards, which are higher than Canadian law, the UN Declaration Standards, and international law. They're trying to say self-determination is basically the same thing as how they define self-government in Canada, which is a municipal fourth level type government is how they're defining it. So there's no one place, one source.
Mhm.
Even the legislation that passed, last year, it amended the First Nations Land Management Act to reduce the threshold for voting to get more bands into that from 50% to 25%, to vote on land codes under that act, which takes you out from the Indian Act, and puts you into the Land Management Act. And also it used to have to go through the cabinet or the governor and council. That they have changed the law last year to say you only need the deputy minister's permission to get into it. So they're trying to accelerate bands getting into this Canadian property and taxation systems. And that was the other law they amended last year, is the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. And again, when that act passed in 2004 under Jean Chrétien, because Jean Chrétien passed both those laws under his government, the Land Management Act was in 1999 and the Fiscal Management Act was in 2004. He wanted to see, the property and tax systems imposed on the reserves, but you have to opt into that. But that's what they're saying. If you want to get into economic development and get out of the Indian Act, those are the laws you have to go into. They're still federal laws.
Thank you for that information. I think we got a couple more minutes here. So just to wrap it up, let everybody know that we were speaking about the white paper of 2019, the agenda, what treaties are, what modern day treaties are. We have some great panelists, and I'd like to thank each and every one of you for coming out, sharing this information, especially with the young people. This is a crucial time. I would like to use the last couple of minutes to say that we have a National Day of Action. People are asking, how can we ally? How can we help? But we already have a National Day of Action happening, and the best thing that you can do for right now is come stand in solidarity with us. Stand up for Indigenous rights. Defending Indigenous rights is defending the land. We would like to say that there is 8 cities participating. If you go to www.theresistancecampaign.ca, that will link you to other sites like I Don't Know More with more information, but you can go get mobilized. We are going to be standing all across coast to coast tomorrow. National Day of Action. We're asking especially young people, this has to do with your children's futures, but also your future as well. These changes aren't something that's going to affect us 20, 30 years down the line. It's going to affect us very soon if we don't stand up, if we don't take action. Just like Chief Judy Wilson had mentioned, the Constitution Express, 2 trains went all the way to Parliament. We have the power to make these changes once we come together. I Don't Know More was a great example what had happened then, and we need the same reaction today. This is urgent, and I'm urging everybody, please stand with us, stand with the Indigenous Activist Network, stand with the young people. We hope to see you out there for the National Day of Action, which is happening tomorrow, coast to coast.
And show your support, wear red. Some of the elders and women are saying, wear red tomorrow.
Yes, National Day of Action tomorrow. There is a lot of stuff that we can do together as a people. Like Dakota said, the power lies within us. And we're doing our best to try to spread the information, spread the knowledge, and mobilize and take action. So I just want to thank you guys all once again for sharing your knowledge, sharing your ideas and your thoughts and your urgent calls to action with us. We are listening and we're trying to answer them.
Best we can. Thank you.